Just because a game is large and beautiful doesn't make it the greatest game ever. It might not even be the greatest game within its own franchise. Is Breath of the Wild the greatest Zelda game ever? No, it's not. It was a great game, and you all know that it would definitely be hard to argue against that. I mean, we waited so long after Skyward Sword for that next console Zelda, and boy, when it came out, was it worth the wait. Now, in the beginning part of the game, I really thought that it would be my favorite Zelda game ever, but as I continued to play it more and more, that feeling just sort of retracted. There were key things that were in past Zelda games that were missing, and change is okay, but you can't get too far away from the things that made you successful. I feel like with Breath of the Wild, there was a lot of potential there, but a lot of that potential went unrealized. There's only one Zelda game that I feel reached its true potential, and that is Ocarina of Time, and this is why it is better than Breath of the Wild. One of the biggest disappointments, and maybe the biggest disappointment with Breath of the Wild, was the story. There's just not much to it for a game this large. We're basically told that 10,000 years ago, thanks to the technological advancements of Hyrule, they were able to create 4 divine beasts and thousands of guardians that were used to defeat Ganon. Once the spirit manifested itself again, it fired off its corruption to every machine. In the great calamity that followed, the king and champions were killed, Link was gravely wounded, and most of Hyrule was devastated. This is the majority of the story that we get from the cutscenes. Now let's fast forward 100 years later, and we're to the events of Breath of the Wild. Link awakens in the Shrine of Resurrection, as you all know, with barely any clothes on. We meet up with the king, and then he tells us that Calamity Ganon has been sealed in Hyrule Castle, but his power is growing and must be defeated. We don't get much else after that. Yeah, you do have the memories, and they offer additional story, but they are not required, and they don't even really make sense until you collect all of them. And then you can also get those memories in any random order, which creates an unstructured story. I'm just not a fan of unstructured stories. To me, they're too chaotic. You can have an open world game and still have a structured story. For example, you have Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag, and GTA 5. And then you can also look within the Zelda franchise and take a Link Between Worlds. Now, while it's not as open world as Breath of the Wild, you could still do things for the most part in any order that you wanted them to, and you still have that structured story of Hyrule, Master Sword, Lorule, Final Boss, and ending. I think Breath of the Wild could have taken some advice from A Link Between Worlds in this aspect. Ocarina of Time was much more structured and therefore could tell a better story. The fairy awakens a young boy in Kokiri Forest. It leads him to the Deku Tree, and the Deku Tree sets Link out as an adventure shortly before dying. Afterwards, we go and we collect 3 spiritual stones, which allows us to get the Master Sword from the Temple of Time. As adult Link, we go through 5 temples to awaken the 5 sages, and then after that, we go to fight Ganon. Now, that part of the story doesn't even include any cutscenes, which expanded on the NES and SNES titles and pushed the franchise forward 19 plus years and counting. We learned about the 3 golden goddesses, Din, Nehru, and Faro. I'm not sure if I pronounced all those right, who created the Triforce at the point where they left the world. We also get more info on said Triforce. We also learned that Link came from the forest, why the Temple of Time was built, how to enter the Sacred Realm through the Door of Time, and who Ganondorf is and his evil intentions. We now know that Breath of the Wild does occur at the end of the Zelda timeline. Which timeline it falls on, we don't know yet, so that's still a good theory that's up for debate. But it could have pushed the franchise forward, but we just didn't get that push. Now, that's not saying that future Zelda games will stink and have a bad story. I'm just saying that Breath of the Wild didn't give it a good set ball to spike like Ocarina of Time did 19 years ago. And future Zelda games can take place before Breath of the Wild, but that doesn't apply to my argument here. Breath of the Wild just didn't feel alive, and that was disappointing. It is understandable that Calamity Ganon destroyed everything 100 years ago, but I still hated so many places being in ruins. I wanted to explore some of these new towns and get to know the town folk, but I just couldn't do that. Yeah, we had villages, towns, cities in the game, but I don't think it was adequate enough for the size of the game. Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, felt very live. Well, at least during the child era. We had children running around Kokiri Forest, the market was bustling with activity, and there was that awesome catchy theme that reflected that. The Hyrule Castle guards were too busy to stop intruders. We had ongoing construction in Kakariko Village, Gorons were rolling around Goron City, Zoras relaxing in Zora's Domain, horses galloping at Lon Lon Ranch, and then the thieves at Gerudo Fortress were throwing trespassers in jail. Every single place that you went, it felt like something was happening. At first, I was very excited to see all the weapons in Breath of the Wild. I thought I'd have a fun time testing them and seeing all the different kind of damages that they could inflict, but that got old very quickly, and that's mainly because of the weapons breaking and breaking only after a few strikes. By the end of the game, I was just drained from switching weapons. It just honestly became a very tedious task. Now I know you can get Korok seeds to expand your inventory, but that takes a while. Well, at least it takes a while for me because apparently I suck at finding Korok seeds because I had the Korok mask. I still only found 300. I don't know how there's 900 in the game, but anyways, I think it takes like 441 Korok seeds to expand your inventory to the max, and that overall can take a very long time to do, and you might even be done with the game by that time. What was even more disappointing was the Master Sword, because it maybe only lasted a minute in combat. I don't understand how a sword that powerful uses energy so quickly. I just think Nintendo really missed on that one. Yeah, I know there's a Trial of the Sword DLC that does fully empower your Master Sword, but that in itself is no easy task, and I hate redoing stages. I hated that before I had a wife and kids, and now that I have a 1-year-old daughter and a pregnant wife, I just don't have the time to redo anything. I think the first time I made through 9 stages and then I died of the beginning trials, and then after that I just never did it again. As you all know, my run straight forward and attack style really doesn't work that well with Trial of the Swords. In the final trials, like if I had that much trouble with the beginning trials, I can only imagine the final trials, how hard and frustrating they must be, and that imagination was brought to reality somewhat by the stories that I've heard online. Now I can't say that Ocarina of Time had better weapons overall, because Breath of the Wild did have such a large variety, but the system was not as frustrating. It was nice to have weapons that didn't break, that you could just use over and over again. While it might not be realistic, is swords breaking after a couple of hits also realistic? I think maybe sharpening your sword might have been a more realistic aspect for Breath of the Wild. Now, while my issue with Breath of the Wild lies within the system and not the weapons, there were sadly some weapons in Ocarina of Time that were missing from Breath of the Wild, and most notably of this is a hookshot, which has been one of my favorite weapons ever since it was introduced in Link to the Past. And then we have some games where we get the double claw shot or hook shot like Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, and that weapon is simply amazing. Now Breath of the Wild did introduce climbing, which is by far my favorite mechanic in the game, and it somewhat replaced the hook shot, but it would have been cool if you're able to shoot to places instead of taking the time to climb. Now with bombs, yeah, they were nice in Breath of the Wild that they didn't run out and that you could just let your meter fill back up to use a bomb again, but I just hate that blue Sheikah technology explosion. Weirdly, guys are attracted to fire. I mean, I can remember being cool ever since I was a young boy, and I like a fiery explosion from a bomb in video games, and we just weren't able to get that satisfaction in Breath of the Wild. With the quantity of shields in Breath of the Wild, I am shocked that we did not get a mirror shield. It's one of my favorite shields in the games that we've gotten in. Now Breath of the Wild, it did have some awesome shields. We had the Ancient, Knights, Royal Guards, and Royal Shield, just to name a few, but the mirror shield, it was still missing. And also, I feel like I gotta mention, I don't care to go and search all of Hyrule Castle to get the Hylian shield just to drop it a short time later from probably an electric keys, and then I gotta pay 3,000 rupees to get it replaced, and that's only if I've completed Tari Town and the side quest that comes with it from the bottom up. Going along with the missing weapons that we had in Ocarina of Time and did not get in Breath of the Wild, I feel like I must also mention the Ocarina item. Yeah, it wasn't neat in Breath of the Wild, but it still been cool to play an instrument. I loved all the Ocarina songs in Ocarina of Time. It adds so much, and it was just a simple concept, and the temple songs were by far my favorite that allowed you to teleport to each temple area. To me, those were just so memorable, and I still listen to them all the time today. Now, teleportation was somewhat replaced by the Sheikah Slate, but it still would have been cool to have an instrument that had some kind of use in Breath of the Wild. I love the music in Zelda. It's one of my favorite parts of the entire franchise, as I'm sure it is for most people. And one of the musical pieces I love the most are the dungeon themes. I'm always excited to see new dungeons and to hear the theme that goes along with them. It really helps set the atmosphere of a dungeon, and it can increase or decrease its value. The Forest Temple and the Spirit Temple, now those are two dungeons that could be great without a theme, but I feel like the theme increased the value significantly. You felt like you were actually adventuring through the dungeon. You had the eerie sound of the Forest Temple. What did this place used to be? What happened to it? It fits alongside the Post Sisters, and it fits that overall ghostly feel. And then you get that frantic chime that makes you speed through the dungeon, making you realize that you have a larger task at hand. It's just a great first adult dungeon. The Spirit Temple reminds you that you are out in the desert, really far from the center of Hyrule, and that theme works really well alongside the color of the dungeon. It makes you feel like you are in a place of worship, and that the Gerudo culture is much greater than anything you got to experience in the game. It was in a perfect position before Ganon's castle. What dungeon themes were great in Breath of the Wild? That's a big fat zero. Hyrule Castle was okay, but that's just an updated remix of a theme that we've gotten in past Zelda games. None of the Divine Beasts had a memorable theme, and I actually have a hard time telling which theme goes along with which beast, and it didn't enhance the feel or the atmosphere of the dungeon / Divine Beast at all. Now at work I like to go back and listen to loop themes, and I do it for many dungeon themes throughout the Zelda franchise, but it's one thing that I haven't done with Breath of the Wild. It was just a major disappointment, which was really surprising, and people have told me to go back and listen to them, which I have, but I still have the same opinion. Now this is not to be confused with dungeon themes. What I'm talking about here is water, forest, fire, etc. They've been a staple throughout many Zelda games, and I always find myself being a fan of the forest and desert themed dungeons, and Ocarina of Time can really be credited with this. They gave us a great variety of themed dungeons. We went inside a Deku Tree, we helped a princess through a disgusting fish, we searched for 4 poles and lush vegetation, we avoided the fiery areas of the Dongo's Cavern and the Fire Temple, we changed water levels in the Water Temple, which we all know everybody loved. We dodged razor sharp guillotines in the Shadow Temple. We redirected Stunlight in the Spirit Temple, and then we made our way through many enemies in Ganon's castle before coming face to face with the final boss. What themed dungeons were in Breath of the Wild? Once again, that's a big fat zero. Now you could argue there's a fire, wind, water, and desert dungeon, but that's mostly just a backdrop. You didn't find those elements largely present inside, and then once you got inside, it all looked very similar, which became boring and stagnant. And then all the bosses looked and felt the same, even though they had different attacks. If you take the name away before Ganon, I'm not even sure I can tell you which boss is which. I'm just surprised Nintendo didn't differentiate more on those. In Breath of the Wild, Hyrule Castle didn't feel like a castle. From close up, it didn't have the structural outline of a castle. It was just a series of ramps and walkways that went to different sections of the castle. It looked amazing from far and had that outline of a castle from far, but when you got close to it, it was far from amazing. Ocarina of Time's Ganon's castle, I just loved making my way all the way through that before fighting Ganondorf. In Breath of the Wild, you can pretty much just walk right up to Ganon, and I hated that. And I actually did on my first trip, but I kind of decided that hey, it's not time to face Ganon yet, so I turned around, I explored some of Hyrule Castle, and overall I was just really not impressed. It kind of goes back to my everything in ruins argument. Now it doesn't make sense that Hyrule Castle looks like this because of the whole Calamity Ganon thing 100 years ago, but that doesn't mean that I have to like it. Calamity Ganon was a joke, and there's really just no other way for me to put it. I was hoping to get the human form of Ganondorf when we got to Hyrule Castle, much like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. It would kind of just add that human element to it, but then when I got there, what I got was this creature that just looked like the other 4 bosses that we got in the Divine Beast, and then there was hardly any intro cutscene for Calamity Ganon. One of my favorite memories in Ocarina of Time is taking that long rest staircase to Ganondorf to fight him in Ganon's castle, and then when you got to the top, he was just sitting there playing that organ, and that whole tune from the organ really set the scene for the ensuing fight. In Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon just drops down to the bottom of Hyrule Castle. Now we do get a cutscene with the 4 champions, but that's only if you complete the 4 Divine Beasts, and all that cutscene is them taking Ganon down to half-life. That's not really an interaction between Link and Ganon. When the fight starts, if you did complete the 4 Divine Beasts, the battle's already halfway won, and it's very easy if you have significant hearts and elixirs. You can basically just run up and slash away. Now, there are different strategies to avoid losing health, but there's really no strategy if you just want to defeat him. After defeating Calamity Ganon, you are just transported out to Hyrule Field, which makes a trip from Hyrule Castle to Hyrule Field very uneventful. We get there and Zelda hands us our Bow of Light, and then we go about defeating Dark Beast Ganon. If you thought the first stage was a letdown, you're about to be even more disappointed. To me, it's one of the biggest disappointments in the Zelda franchise. We just ride our horse around and shoot arrows at certain targets while avoiding his easy to avoid attacks. No final boss should be this easy, especially for a game this large. Dark Beast Ganon, now I will admit that he did look cool, but just because it looks cool doesn't mean it delivers a great experience. Now let's compare this to the final boss in Ocarina of Time. We get that sweet intro cutscene with Ganondorf. As I already said, he's sitting there, he's playing the organ, and it really sets a tune for the ensuing fight. And then once we do start to fight him, we gotta avoid falling platforms while also dodging his attacks. And then after dodging his attacks, we gotta find a strategy to defeat him. We can't just rush forward and attack. And then eventually we do figure out to shoot him with a light arrow, hook shot over to him, and then slash away with our sword. After the first stage, we get a pleasant surprise. Now you gotta remember, when Ocarina of Time was released, we were used to only finding one stage of a final boss, but Ganondorf lays wounded at the top of a castle, and then with his final breath, he brings the castle crumbling down, and we have to escape before time runs out. We're always used to going up a castle, but rarely do we have to go back down a castle, and it offers spectacular views that we were only able to get at that part of the game. And it was just also very intense. We had to jump over gaps and defeat enemies, and we had to do all this while not landing on Zelda. Now maybe that wasn't a huge problem for you, but I can remember jumping on Zelda many times and actually falling off the edge. So we finally reached the bottom of Ganon's castle, and then you think the battle was done? Nope, we still have one more stage with Pig Beast Ganon, and just the sheer size and look of Ganon was outstanding. And he was very difficult if you didn't know the road between leg strategy, which I actually didn't know at the very beginning, and that's how a final boss should be. When you take all 3 of those stages of the final boss, it is easily better than the final boss we got in Breath of the Wild. Going along with the uneventful story, the ending was also bad. For a game this large, it was just too short and anticlimactic. So let me give you a little bit of the ending. Zelda steals Calamity Ganon away, she informs Link she's been watching his journey, and then she asks if he remembers her. We get the King and the Champion spirits floating above Hyrule Castle, and then after the credits roll, we get Zelda and Link going to investigate a non-functional Ruta, and they talk about restoring Hyrule to its former glory. I was expecting so much more and hoping to get some additional storyline, and we just didn't get it. In Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf is sent into the void of the evil realm by the sages, but we still have some communication with him, and he tells us that when the seal is broken, he will exterminate all of our descendants. I love this communication we get with him after he is sealed away. And then we talk with Zelda, who informs us that we must lay the Master Sword to rest and close the door of time, which in turn closes the road between times. So then we hand Zelda our Ocarina, and she sends Link back to the time when he was a child. Then after the credits roll, we get Link back in the Temple of Time, laying the Master Sword in its pedestal. And then Navi flies away. Where did she go? That's up to the player's imagination. And then we get that last scene with Link in the Hyrule Courtyard, about to talk to Zelda. What exactly is he going to say? And then it cuts off, and once again it's up to the player's imagination to think about what he said. How can you beat an ending like that? Now there's one last thing that I want to address, and that's the credits. It's one of my favorite parts in many Zelda games. We get a great combination of songs and then a tour of all the areas. Breath of the Wild, it was a little disappointing. The music wasn't bad, but just wasn't as good as in Ocarina of Time, and it incorporated more of the characters than the areas, and I was actually surprised by how few areas they showed in the credits. When I've been in a Zelda game, the credits give me that fulfillment and accomplishment. I just didn't feel that with Breath of the Wild. Now maybe this is a petty argument to you, but it's a feeling that I experienced. There are two more points that I have that didn't fit into a prior section, but I still want to address them. I've always been a fan of forest areas in Zelda games, and I kind of blame Ocarina of Time for that because it gave us Kokiri Forest, the Lost Woods, Sacred Meadow, and the Forest Temple. And then we've had many other Zelda games that had a great forest, like Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, and Minish Cap. Now sadly, Breath of the Wild was not one of them. It looked more like a tropical rainforest with all the palm trees, and then it acted like a tropical rainforest with all the rain that we got. I honestly thought I would spend a lot of time in the forest in Breath of the Wild, but then by the end I actually spent the least amount of time there. It was surprising and disappointing all at the same time. And my other point, how did Breath of the Wild not incorporate diving is beyond me. It's a missing mechanic that I think felt very constrained in the water, and there was so much water in the game that diving would have added to the exploration. There's a whole new world underwater that we just weren't able to explore. In Ocarina of Time, we had two ways of getting underwater. We could dive down for a certain period of time based on if you had the silver scale or the gold scale, or we could equip the iron boots and sink to the bottom. And then if you had the Zord tunic, you could stay underwater for as long as you wanted. It was a very simple concept that I think Nintendo should have put in Breath of the Wild. Hopefully I've given you enough reasons why Ocarina of Time is better than Breath of the Wild. I believe that I have. Ocarina of Time, it just feels like everything came together in the game. I often tell people that it perfected the formula. It had the right combination of elements that makes a game great. Many people talk about how large Breath of the Wild is, but in 1998, Ocarina of Time also felt that large. And there's also many open world games nowadays with large maps, but when Ocarina of Time came out, it was a game changer. It was like nothing else, and it's still my favorite Zelda game today. Now this should go without saying, but I still feel like I need to say it. This wasn't an opinion video, it's 100% subjective. It's based on feelings that I experienced with both games, and your feelings might not be the same as mine. Everyone experiences things a little bit differently, and if you strongly disagree with me, that is absolutely fine. I understand this comes off as me bashing Breath of the Wild, but it's honestly my second favorite Zelda game, and it's great for so many reasons. It's just a different video for a different time. But how do you feel about this? Do you agree or disagree with all of it? With some of it? Let me know down in the comments section. And until next time, keep on playing Zelda.